All right, today's topic, everybody, is why website projects fail. It is a part 2. The subtitle is Factors That Will Cost or Earn You Thousands of Dollars. If you're on the call, you one of two things is probably either have occurred or is going to occur. You have been through an unsuccessful website project. It happens a lot. There's some pretty bleak statistics out there in terms of how many website projects fail. 29% of website projects fail objectively. 57% fail subjectively. So you're probably in either that category, and you just want to educate yourself now on what you can do differently in the future to avoid being in that boat of project coming up. And you really are investing in your department, you're investing in yourself. You want to understand website development more so that as you represent your brand, you can make the best decisions possible so that your website project is successful. So I acknowledge you for that and welcome to the call. Before we begin, I want to just go over some quick housekeeping items to make the event more successful for you. We are on Twitter. Feel free to find us at TBK Creative. The hashtag for the event is TBKU. I'll personally be managing the Twitter account today during the event, so ask any questions if you want on Twitter. Comment if you want, or any quotations that you want to tweet out, feel free. In terms of asking questions, feel free to do that as well at any time to keep background noise down. We do naturally mute everybody, or we wouldn't be able to hear each other. So if you have a question, feel free to just ask it in the chat box. So let's try it just for a moment, just to make sure you know where it is. There's on your webinar control panel, there should be a subtitle called chat. So go ahead and maybe just say hi, and I'll let you do that for a moment. All right, hello everybody. Yeah. Hello back. Cool. All right, so you guys now know how to do that. So feel free to ask questions at any time. If it's a question that I can kind of grab as the moderator and ask our experts today on the spot, I will. Some questions will, of course, be left to the Q&A section as well. We will have some time for that at the end. All right, now I'll introduce our guests. We have two guests today. First person is Andre Lafort. Andre is the head of technology at TBK Creative. He's a software engineer with over 15 years of professional programming experience. Previous to TBK, Andre was a senior programmer at 3M Canada, where he was one of the lead developers who built the current 3M enterprise-level e-commerce website. So we wanted to bring him back on this call. He's a guy who has a tremendous amount of professional experience when it comes to building very enterprise-level websites and software, and then scale down to smaller websites as well. So he's someone with a lot of experience. The second expert joining us today is Melissa McInerney. Melissa is a principal at TBK Creative and the creative director with the firm. She is a 5-time international award-winning marketer. She's an award-winning entrepreneur, and every day she oversees and is accountable for the digital asset production area of TBK Creative, which basically means, in a lot of cases, web development. So she goes through these conversations a lot, speaking directly with clients, and has heard probably, almost every challenge that I think is quite common out there in terms of what clients go through naturally. It's something that matters to her. She's someone who always is trying to improve systems and processes for the industry and our company. So she also is an expert in this area, and we thought we'd bring her on the call as well. So without ado, welcome Andre and Melissa to the call.
Thank you, Andrew. All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Melissa, maybe to kind of kick it off, maybe it'd be good to recap part one a little bit, and then let everybody know what to expect out of this call today.
For sure. Well, part one, thank you everyone who's coming back to join us. Part one, basically what we discussed, and I'll actually just kind of skim through these particular slides here. Andrew did point out the entire intention for creating this whole series was that There's a lot of web projects that never really get the opportunity to be as great as they can be. Some never even see the light of day. So this particular slide here says 29% of website projects never actually go live. It's a huge statistic, and it's certainly alarming. And we've seen it, you know, out and about in the industry. We meet a lot of people who kind of acknowledge previous failures with websites. You know, 86% of website projects are considered a failure in some way. So that could mean that they weren't on time, they weren't on budget, or generally speaking, expectations weren't met. And that's another alarming statistic. And given that websites oftentimes are such an integral part of how a business functions, we decided that this webinar was really timely. So that's a little bit of refresh, and that's for really people who are also new to this topic. So here's what we talked about on the previous webinar. We went over the general state of affairs in the web and digital industry. If you haven't listened to part one, I highly suggest you go back and do that, because it talks about what's happening in the web and digital industry, from the different types of companies that are coming out to bid on RFPs or bid on website projects. You know, what's going on when websites are being built, what's going on from a budgetary perspective with companies. It gives you basically a foundation to have this discussion. So I would just suggest going back just to listen to that one part. And then what we decided to do is break down a website in terms of its general phases. So generally speaking, we often go through scoping and quoting first. And then once a company and a vendor have decided to work together, oftentimes what's next is discovery. And discovery is very different. Every web company does that in a different way. And of course, every company handles all of these different phases, you know, with different process and procedure. So we got through scoping and quoting and discovery. Now what we're going to be talking about on this webinar is design, programming, testing and quality assurance, launch, and post-launch. And we're really focusing our conversation on oftentimes the things that can go awry or that can go wrong or can cause basically problems in these particular phases. So I'm going to start off, and as creative director, I often am working one-on-one with clients in the design phase. So I'm going to work. So I think we're going to start with design first, and then Andre Lafort, he really has his hands on the programming, testing and quality assurance, launch and post-launch phases. So he's going to basically be walking us through some of the pitfalls that can happen inside of those phases, and of course, what you can do to arm yourself. And I think that's the most important point of all of this is you're not necessarily digital experts. You're doing your best to hire the right firm. And a lot of times there's just not a lot of information with how these phases, some of the typical problems and what you can do about them. So we're going to certainly arm you with lots of great information to make sure that on your next project, these phases go much, much more smoothly. All right. So we're going to start with, on this particular part 2 series, we're going to start with design. So inside of a website project, it's natural after discovery to start going into design. And why that's really exciting is design is the first opportunity that you actually get to see something. Now, you're not necessarily seeing the actual project being programmed. You're actually seeing, say, first mock-ups or wireframes of what's happening. So this happens right after discovery, and I like to say that it's where the creative really brings the project to life. For this reason, me personally, I actually love this phase. It's where people get inspired and excited, and it's usually come right off the heels of discovery. So we've learned about a lot about each other, how TBK works and how your company works. And for that reason, people are extremely inspired. Now, there are some things, so this phase is typically smooth, but there are certain things that certainly happen in this phase that can make it not go as smooth as it could. So the very first thing that I think is a pitfall of this particular phase is not looping in decision makers for a first review. And basically what I'm referring to is, if we've done wireframing, or if a company that you're working with has wireframed or shown you first designs, and those are usually not clickable, just here's how we think this page ought to be laid out. The moment that comes in, we suggest looping in anybody who needs to have an opinion on that right away. And the reason for that is a lot of times, I'm just going to go to this slide here. A lot of times, most web companies limit you to a certain number of revisions. So, a lot of times if we're working with a marketing manager, we might go through 2 rounds of revisions just with them to get it perfect. And then all of a sudden we send it out to a few more people and we've forgotten something, something else needs to be added, something needs to be moved around, and you run out of rounds of revisions and then you're into extra costs. So I understand where people are coming from, that they often want, if there's somebody who has to give approval from a higher level, if there's, if you're in that boat, I highly suggest that the moment you get something in, even if you're already seeing 3 things that you would change, I would suggest looping everybody in that conversation, because what you'll do is you'll get a really good sense. You'll have a nice collaborative session of what everybody's seeing, what everybody likes, what everybody thinks needs to be changed. And what you can do is send over all your commentary and feedback in one shot to your web vendor. I think that given this phase can be such an exciting time in a web project, it's just best to make sure that everybody's experiencing that excitement, getting involved, deciding what needs to be included and not included, and layout. And that way you're minimizing revisions and you're also minimizing time, especially if web projects have a tight deadline. You will definitely, if you do this right from the get-go, you will certainly reduce the amount of time that goes into the project. So that's basically one little pitfall, is you could go 3 rounds of revisions in and decision makers haven't seen it, and all of a sudden you send it over and you might have been working for a week to get it to the point of what you might think is perfect. You send it out to a few people and they're all going, oh shoot, we forgot this and we got to add this in. And then you're going back to the drawing board. And it can also be a little bit disheartening at that point too, because some of your ideas might have been shut down. So it's just best to get everybody involved. That's one thing that you can prevent in your next web project or the project that you might be in currently. It also loops into number 2, possibly going past your rounds of revisions. So basically, whenever a web firm is quoting out a website project, they're just allotting a certain amount of time, a certain amount of hours they think it's going to complete that project. And to keep hours in check, most contracts will have a limit on rounds of revisions. Oftentimes, the general in the industry is 3. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. But if you organize it well, 3 is a really good amount of revisions. Typically, you can get all your feedback and basically ensure that every page that you're designing is good within 3 rounds. So where this can be a pitfall is if you end up going past those 3 rounds of revisions. And if you end up going past, that's when extra costs could come in. So as a client, if you're already in a web project, you can go back and if you're not at the stage yet, you can certainly ask these questions. And if you haven't started a web project, I highly suggest you just ask these questions to a web vendor. Just get a sense of, this information. Sometimes it's buried in the terms and conditions in a contract. It's good to just get it straight out. So the first question you can just ask is, how many concepts do I receive? So you can just be clear on exactly how many revisions you get. The next question is, if you require more rounds of revisions, what's the process? Now, every company does have a process. It might just be, we'll just track hourly to see how much time we end up going past. We might do a project quote per each revision, and that happens too. It's just good to ask those questions. And it's also good, once you get the answers, to share it with everybody so that everyone's on board with, hey guys, we've got 3 rounds of revisions on this particular design. Let's do our research. Let's make sure that we're certain on the suggestions that we're offering. And then you can stay within those rounds. This is a really good question. A lot of times, web vendors don't really want things to go out of scope. They don't want, to continue, to add on extra costs in a website project. So you can ask your web vendor, how do you help ensure that you stay within the allotted revisions? They're the experts on how to build websites, and they will hopefully have some, suggestions with how do we stay within those 3 rounds? What's best practices? And they might have some other tips and tricks. So, making sure that you're clear what your rounds of revisions are and how do you stay within those rounds is really important. And any type of tips, and that first pitfall, including everybody right from the get-go, the moment you see a first design, even if it's not perfect and there's 5 things you'll change, get everybody involved. I think that's the number 1 way to help to ensure that you stay within those revisions. All right, another pitfall of design. oftentimes design can forget about goals and web intentions. And for me, the two are inherently linked. But sometimes design can go down this pure creative path, and you have to make sure that you marry equally creative with goals. So that's another pitfall of design. Oftentimes it's not a pitfall necessarily that clients experience right off the start. Sometimes clients experience it after the website goes live and it's not giving them the leads that they had expected or wanted. So it might not be a pitfall that you experience immediately, but it's a pitfall that can happen. So, you know, again, here's some things to ask. Ask your existing web vendor or web vendors you're considering hiring. Who is the creative director or designer working on my project, and what's their background? This is a great question. It lets you know who's going to be having creative decision-making process and helping you craft what your website ought to be looking like, and get an understanding of what their background is. And background, you could be asking for great case studies of websites that they've worked on that have had positive goals reached. And that is a great question to ask. And what you're going to be listening for is basically a confidence in someone's answer. You're going to be wanting to hear answers that are ROI based or goal based, like we took a website from 20 leads to 30 leads per month. So that's the type of answers that you're looking to hear. You could ask the question, how do you ensure the website is both beautiful and functional while ensuring that the goals are met? And it's a tightrope to walk to ensure that your website is going to be beautiful while still ensuring that you're utilizing techniques and tactics that are going to help hit your goals. And again, what you're listening there for is confidence that somebody is aware of this every single time that they're designing a page, and that they're not just going to go, full on creative and forget what the web goals of each individual page are on the whole website. This is a question that you can ask yourself, so it's not necessarily a vendor question. I would ask yourself every time you're seeing a new, say, page design, go back to your own goals. Go back to the goals of, hey, we have to have people land on our contact us page and fill out a form. Oh, we have to have this goal, and we have to have this goal on the website. We have to have HR is, in the past year, we've heard that HR is a really strong goal, that people are clear what the jobs are on the website. And if that's a goal, the question is, how does that particular page you're looking at help hit that goal? And it's something that you can continuously ask yourself, and you can even pose to the entire decision-making group. So, whenever you're reviewing a design, I always go back to the goals and say, are we hitting those? Are we doing the best job possible to make sure that those goals are hit without compromising design and functionality? And that's where your creative director can help you make sure that happens. And another pitfall, and this is the last pitfall that I find with design, so something that can make the design phase not go as smoothly, is not having a clear defined approval process. So when you're looking at those designs, when you're finally getting them in your hands, the question is, are you clear on the process it takes to actually approve and hop on to the next design? And basically, approvals are basically you telling the web vendor, yes, I am more than happy with this, and we can go ahead and now do another page. Or we're more than happy with the 5 designs we've looked at. We're giving our approval to go into programming. I found that when I'm speaking with people that have gone through a previous web build, they're not necessarily certain. They weren't aware that there was an approval process, or there might not have been an approval process. Or if there is an approval, they're not sure exactly what they're approving. And that's really important, because without a clear approval process, people necessarily, so all the decision makers, aren't clear what can be altered moving forward, say text or images, what new additions, how do you handle new additions? We're going to talk about that on the next slide. But it's really important to be clear what an approval means. I know that's sounding kind of vague, so we'll give an example. We love working with websites, and we love designing websites that have content previously written. So before we even design a main page, or before we design the FAQ page, I'm just giving examples of typical pages. it's good to have the content in your hands. And that's because it really affects the design that ends up coming out. However, I would say 70% of the websites we build, we don't have content prior to design. And that's because content's a huge chunk of a web build. It takes a lot of time to do. So we oftentimes don't have that, and we basically submit dummy text. It's that lorem ipsum text if anyone's ever seen it before. So basically we sub in a whole bunch of lorem ipsum text. The question is, if you're in that boat and you don't have all your copy written for a website, what of that, how much of that text do you get to change? If you're approving this design to say, yes, I approve, we can go and do the next design and move forward, what can you change of that in the future? And that's just kind of one example where you'll want to be clear. And I'll also give you an example of a process. So TBK, we actually have a website, basically a custom website that we've designed, which we upload all of our designs to. And when you're ready, there's an approve button. You click it, it pops it, and it says exactly what you're approving. I approve that this website, that these designs are complete, that there's no other graphical additions that are required, and that if there are any other additions, that you understand that there could be extra time added to the project or an extra budget. So just making sure that, that's our process. And basically whenever somebody hits the approve button, it gets emailed to our team, and we're now clear that we can either go into programming or keep going into design. And that's our process. So just ask your web vendor, what's their process? What exactly are you approving? And if something needs to change in the future, so if there's a change to something that you've approved, how is that handled, and what are fees involved, if there are any fees? All right, so that is common pitfalls in design. Now we're about to go into programming, and there are a lot more pitfalls inside of programming than there are design. I would say the programming stage can be the most tumultuous stage in a web project. So I will hand it off to Andre to kind of just give us a little bit of an understanding of what exactly is programming, and I'll pop back in to talk about something that links to design, and then we'll keep going. And this certainly is the stage that the more knowledge you can equip yourself, the better your web project's going to go.
Thanks, Melissa. And I absolutely agree with that. The programming stage really is truly the most challenging stage in a web build. Experience has taught me this, and I'm still continually learning. But the following slides should help equip you with a few questions and some pointers on what you'd like to hear from a vendor when you're discussing what they do during the programming phase. So, in a nutshell, the programming phase involves taking the beautiful artwork that was created in the design phase. So for us at TBK, my team receives the design files from Melissa's design department. And we then take these designs and essentially bring them to life. We turn it into a functioning website, and from there on in, essentially we're down the rabbit hole.
Yep.
So some common pitfalls in this stage, probably the biggest one is what happens when you come up with groovy new ideas. Did you want to jump in, Melissa?
Yeah, I'm jumping in because a lot of times this is something that can happen in the creative phase, so that the design phase previously, and it happens a lot in programming as well. It is extremely natural to come up with awesome new ideas for your website, especially once you've seen that first design, or once you're actually seeing your beta website and you're clicking around and using it. I don't think I've ever managed or designed a website that has not had at least one new concept brought up and added to the website. And it's almost like I really wish that we could do the full design discovery stage before we quote, because sometimes those ideas really are going to make a bottom line difference to a website. Absolutely. There's a lot of times I'm working with clients, I'm going, man, that addition has to get in there. So, make an assumption that certainly you're going to come up with new ideas because, in my experience, it almost always happens. And, the thing to keep in mind is oftentimes the vendor has quoted what they knew at the time in terms of hours, and then that's where a project price comes from. So there are ways to handle squeezing in those new ideas or, ways to get those ideas in or ways to evaluate if those ideas are worth it. So here's some questions to ask your web designer, your web design company or your agency. What happens if you want something that wasn't originally in the scope or something that you just came up with on a whim, like, oh, you know what, on the blog, we should have a survey area. And that survey is going to allow us to collect market research data that we're currently paying another firm to give us. Great idea. It actually saves dollars at the end of the day. And that idea might save, who knows, whatever people are, all those types of relationships are a little bit different, but that could be a fantastic idea. If those types of things come up in a web project, what happens? And I'll give you an example of what happens within TVK Creative. So basically, whenever those ideas come up, and they always come up, what I do oftentimes is the project manager and creative director, depending on my role in a particular project, is the very first thing I do is evaluate how fundamental that is to achieving the website's goals. So every time an idea comes up, and a lot of times ideas might get thrown at you. If you're the marketing manager and you're responsible for a web build, you might have other people in the company saying, oh my goodness, HR department, we need this. And it was just something you couldn't have known when you started the project. So you're probably going to be handling basically, everyone's going to want everything on the website. It's your job to kind of think of, go back to the website goals and say, how important is this on those goals? If it doesn't hit any of those goals, you have to ask yourself if it's really necessary. If it's adding a new goal, like, that example that we just talked about, a goal might be, now we're going to use this website to collect market research data so we don't have to, work with an outsourced market research firm. That's basically adding to the scope of the website in the sense that you're putting a new goal in there. And something you can do when that happens is now you go back and say, how much is this worth to us? And then what you can do is work with the web vendor, and you're basically you're prioritizing. You're saying, how important is this thing? And if it comes out that it's not that important, it can be something that goes into a phase 2 of a website. A lot of larger builds go through, first let's get it live, and then we'll reevaluate in 3 months, and then maybe we'll put it in. And on something that's not extremely important, I highly suggest doing that because scope changes pretty darn quick and needs change quickly. So it's nice to have just a website out there being used because, you might learn that within 3 months, it ends up being a high priority, or it ends up being a no priority and something else takes priority over it. So if it's low priority, I suggest tabling it and just putting into like a list that, you can use as almost a review 3 months after your website goes live. If it's a high priority item, something you can do is go chat with the vendor and see if there's any buffer time to add in. And there may or may not be, depending on what stage you're at in the project. If there's buffer time, perfect. If there's not buffer time, and basically getting a quote from the web vendor, say how much extra would it be to put that in? Okay, and then you get that, and now everyone gets to decide internally, hey, is this something we need to do right now? Is it pivotal? Is it going to help us hit our goals? And then if it's yes, it just becomes another piece of the website. So that's how TVK handles all these awesome groovy new ideas. But I like to keep going back to the fundamental reason of, what are the fundamental goals of the website and keep working from there.
Mel, can I jump in with a question for you?
Mm-hmm.
I know we've spoken about this before. Would you still recommend that clients, and I know we've even told clients this before, would you still recommend that clients set aside a quote unquote in case fund of, let's call it 5 or 10%? They don't even have to tell the vendor this, but in terms of their own budgeting, if they have to get it, especially if they have to get it approved fiscally in advance, should a client set aside an in-case fund of maybe 5 or 10% of the overall website cost? for those items, those groovy new ideas that may come up in either in the website development project or right after launch, as they start to gain more knowledge as well about what really matters about this project.
For sure. You totally took the words out of my mouth, so thank you. I actually have mentioned this to clients, and we really have talked about this, because it's so hard to know all the pieces that your website's going to need in a scoping process. So if you were to create a buffer, and I like to relate to web builds like you're renovating a home. Every home renovation, or it's best practice in a home renovation to set aside 10% for the unknown. You know, you rip open a wall and you see mold, and that has to be handled by a professional. You never know what's going to happen in a home reno. Websites are kind of the same way. So set aside a nice little buffer of 5 or 10%, so that when somebody comes up with a new idea, it doesn't all of a sudden end up in this, oh, now we have these extra costs that we have to come up with, and that can be certainly stressful. You don't even have to tell your web vendor this. Setting aside 5 to 10% is a brilliant idea, because it oftentimes will help lead to a better end product that's going to help support your business in a more meaningful, stronger way. Andrew, it's a phenomenal point, and it really helps to ensure that everyone's ideas can be listened to and acknowledged, and there's there's a way to integrate them, basically.
Yeah, and if you're in a larger organization, this is when it becomes really important, because oftentimes you need to be going to department heads or above that for your budgeting. So I've become a big believer in that. Certainly, if I was on the corporate side and I needed to ask for money every year, let's say I asked for 80 grand for my new website for my business, I certainly would be asking for that 80, and then maybe issuing that RFP out at a $70,000 budget or a $75,000 budget. That would be my recommendation, because if you don't do that, the challenge then becomes, as Mel pointed out, it's more like, oh, there's extra costs, and nobody wants to hear extra costs, right? You don't want to hear extra costs. Your boss doesn't want to hear extra costs. Nobody wants to hear extra costs. So I think it's a valid idea. I think it's a valid point, and you can avoid a lot of that emotional pain up front by just actually having that buffer set aside, and then you get to go back to your boss and say, hey, look, boss, I actually came in under budget.
Yeah, exactly. Like if no ideas, if no new ideas come up, then awesome, you come in under budget, which is fantastic. Okay, cool. Another question that you can ask, ask your web vendor, what project management style or framework do they use when new ideas happens? A lot of times, truthfully, we'll have anywhere from 5 to 10 new ideas, and we like to store them inside of our project management system. We love to use Basecamp. It's super easy. We literally just create a list, new ideas or next ideas in there to help prioritize. So that's just another idea that, it's just another question. Okay, if we're coming up with a ton of ideas, how do we make sure that we don't lose them all? Like, what project management style or framework are you going to be using? All right, Andre, I will let you certainly know a lot more about this topic than I do.
You learn quite a bit yourself, though.
Thanks.
And another pitfall with the programming phase in web builds is hiring junior programmers. Yes, they likely cost less, but you'll quickly realize that they may not be able to deliver the business-specific goals that you'd asked for. So when you're hiring your firm, ask them questions about their programmers. Try and get their resumes, some bio, maybe even talk with them up front. Ask the web vendor what their team's strengths and weaknesses are in regards to certain technologies. And probably above all, ask them how they keep good talent. These 3 questions should be able to flush out some of the red flags that might come up. You want to know that they're open talking about their employees and the skills that they have, and you also want to know that they likely have a senior programmer on the team, someone who has the experience in leading a team or designing and building systems that are a little more complex.
Um, I think that this is an extremely important point. We have just, almost learned the hard way, truthfully. Most of TBK's programmers are actually seniors.
Not
Um,
most, I think every one of us.
I think every one of us is a senior. And we do that because, you know, um, in programming, there are so many different things to be responsible with all the different devices that exist, how those devices like to handle code, oh my goodness, Java, images, text, and there's all these little nuances that truthfully over time you just learn. Like Windows 7 phones not handling typekit well, or yeah, and I'm honestly just giving one example of all the different nuances. And you just learn over time. You take all of this knowledge and just having this experience. So one problem that might have taken 8 hours to troubleshoot and find a solution for on the next web projects takes 10 minutes. And there are hundreds of examples of that. So if your team is mostly comprised of junior programmers, they are certainly going to experience stumble blocks that they might not have encountered in the past. And, that's just going to equate to a lot more time being spent on the project or not necessarily the best solution implemented. So yeah, it's kind of the analogy of hiring a lawyer. If you hire a junior lawyer, their hourly might be less, but they may spend 3 times longer needing to do more research to be able to provide you great advice. The hourly might be less, but in the long run, you'll pay more versus going to somebody with a higher hourly and they just have been doing this for 10 years and they can just, give you the contracts or the support they need. Same conversation here. So just because you might be hiring somebody who came directly out of school or working with somebody who came from school does not mean that they're coming from 5 years experience of actually coding in the web to learn all of the nuances and it's just an enormous amount of nuances on the web, and we keep uncovering them every project. We always uncover something new on every single project we do. So it's important to have a team of at least one senior. I suggest more than one senior so that everyone can get support when they come up with one of those problems.
Absolutely. Another key factor in your project success and a pitfall is lack of communication. And then, this point likely applies to every phase of the project, but I wanted to highlight it in this phase because, as Melissa mentioned, priorities change, markets shift, new ideas come up, and since we're blurring the lines between design and programming, and there might even be marketing involved, it's really important that your team of programmers is able to communicate effectively, first of all, amongst themselves, and amongst other teams within the organization, and with yourself as well as the client. So you'll likely want to ask questions that would show to you that they do have processes in place, they do communicate well. You want to know how to communicate and when. Can I talk to your programmers throughout the day via phone? Is email more appropriate? Do we Skype? Get these things sorted out up front so that you know what to expect when the project starts. Oftentimes, maybe not often, but there are times when certain projects will go into programming and you may not hear from anyone for days, weeks, I hope not months, but I'm sure it's possible, at a time. And frankly, that's not a position you want to be in. You want a constant feedback loop. You want to know that the developers aren't making decisions on your behalf without communicating with you. This is above all your project, and it really needs to become a dialogue between yourself and the team.
Absolutely.
And leading into that is the idea of teams lacking common processes. One of them could evolve around communication, and there's other processes that the team should employ as well. And questions you may want to ask is, how do you store the code that you're writing? Is it backed up? Can it be audited? If we discover a bug down the road, how do we know when it was introduced, possibly why it was introduced, and how we fix it? You'll also want to ask questions in regards to how do they control quality of the code throughout the project. You want to know what coding standards they comply with. These are all little details that may seem trivial at first, But knowing that the firm you're working with has processes and structures in place to work with these questions, to work with these issues, these problems, will mean that stages down the road will be a little more smooth. So you want to hear that these are in place, there's confidence in what they're talking about, that they're flexible, and that they are more than willing to include you in these processes.
And just as a note for everybody joining us, I know we are covering a ton of content here. There is going to be a video for this, so you don't have to, like, if you're trying to feverishly write down information because you know, like, you're not certain what code stored backed up is, and you would not be alone. Don't worry, there's going to be a video for this so that you can go back and access it.
Absolutely, you can listen to us endlessly if you so choose to. I'm not sure why you would want to, but you could. So that leads us to the next stage, really. After the website's been built, we've really transformed the design files into a working website. Now we need to make sure that this product we've built performs well. It meets the goals that were originally decided upon earlier in the project, and works on a multitude of laptops, desktops, the browsers available on those computers, and then there's even all the mobile devices, phones, tablets, and who knows where we're going next. You know, we're going to have wearable devices, and if that's part of the deal, then we need to make sure that your website works on those. So, common pitfalls in the this slide is mislabeled. So really, what this is meant to stress test all the work we've put in and to make sure that it works across all these devices and browsers. And common pitfalls for this stage, the very first one is kind of a big one, and that is not including a quality assurance step. So quality assurance, for short, is QA, popularized in factory settings where maybe not everything that comes off of the factory line, but samples are tested for quality assurance. We apply the same idea to the product we've built. So you want to know they have a quality assurance step. If they don't, big red flag. You want to know who's involved in this step and what your role will be, because whether or not it works in browsers and devices doesn't really mean that you approve of everything as well. So there's a type of testing called user acceptance testing, and that's when typically the vendor would involve the client to make sure that everything is to their liking. Much like Melissa in her design department had an approval process for the design files, we now need to make sure that essentially we've translated those design files accurately and that it meets your standards. You might also...
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Andre.
Go on.
I wanted to mention, this terminology might be so new to people. That's that phase that you were talking about, you know, where you finally get the opportunity to grab your own website and click and use it and send it out to people, but it's not live yet. Typically, people call that a beta or an alpha, depending on what stage it is. If you're hearing those types of terminology, that means that, you know, you typically get your hands on the website, which is fantastic. But quality assurance is certainly different. So it's not the same as you finally getting access to click around on the website. It can be included in that, but quality assurance is such a bigger picture of, does this work the way we need it to work across the devices we've all agreed to?
Exactly. And we've had web builds where we've had to test 4,000 separate test cases. It is incredibly in-depth and incredibly tedious. That leads me into the next pitfall, and that is, so your vendor may have a QA process, but you want to make sure that it's structured. You want to make sure that there are automated safeguards in place to ensure that little bugs, little issues that are easy to find can be discovered without waiting months down the road after we've launched the product. So certain questions you'll want to ask, again, is what is my involvement? What kind of reporting can you provide me that might indicate to me known bugs, issues that we have that were known that are now fixed, what's outstanding, possible issues, just a general quality of the code. You also want to ask, how do we track bugs and defects that are discovered? You want to know that there's a system that is used, whether it's a spreadsheet or it's a sophisticated tool. You want to know that something is in place where items are reported, items are fixed, and then verified. So you want to make sure that there's a structure.
For sure. I was just going to pop in here and, give a little bit of background on bugs. If this is your first web build, or you're looking to go through one of your first larger web builds, every code has bugs in it. Your phones are constantly, and the apps are constantly doing updates, because a lot of times technology is just changing so rapidly that bugs exist and not everything works all the time. So it's normal to have bugs, but what you really require is not just a phase that says, oh yeah, we've tested this on Internet Explorer 9 and 10. You really need a structured, thorough process to go, okay, here's all of the list of devices we say our website is going to be compatible with. And then you can go through and start, actually seeing that's happening. So I just wanted to give, the word bugs almost sounds like it's nobody wants to have bugs on their website. But I guess I just wanted to explain to people that it is natural to have bugs, but a lot of clients have kind of expressed in the past that they feel like they're the beta tester. They get sent a beta link and they find egregious errors, like multitudes and multitudes of errors. And they almost have this pressure and this responsibility, like it's up to them to find all of these. And it's quite stressful when that happens. If you've ever been through a project and you've experienced that, it's extremely stressful. And it's not really your responsibility to say, be finding, a ton of bugs. You certainly will find bugs with any web vendor, any project. You really like a few for certain, but finding, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 bugs is probably a sign that it's not been quality assurance tested. And then we go to this slide.
Yeah, and I have a question, and I think it is going to be related to this slide, but slightly off to another vein. Mm-hmm. What expectations should clients have these days? So on the corporate end, around what browsers and devices that their website should be tested and compatible for?
Great question. I bet that's something. I bet that's a question that, honestly, web firms are solidifying answers if they haven't solidified their answers already, and it's a really smart question to ask. Andre, I'll let you answer that because Andre has completely led. We have a whole browser compatibility. We have a bunch of documentation surrounding this. So Andre, take it away.
Absolutely, and Andrew, that's a wonderful question, because for a web vendor to say, let's say you've asked me that question, and for a web vendor to say we support all browsers, all modern browsers and all devices is just unrealistic. The vast landscape of devices and browser options and computer screen sizes just makes it prohibitively time-consuming and expensive to thoroughly test all the combinations. So this really, you need to form the correct answer to this question really comes down to a few things. One, what are the requirements of your project? What are the demographics of your project? Depending on who you are building the website for, it will help you shape, should you be catering to new devices and new browsers, or should we be a little more conservative and make sure that a browser that's maybe 3 years old will still behave properly, because our demographic might be using devices that are older. So that's an important thing to do up front with in the discovery phase. But if a vendor were to come out and say flat, what devices do we support? Typically, you want to see at least an 80 to 90% coverage of modern day browsers and devices. So at TPK, for an example, I think we cover about 90% of global web traffic in the QA stage that we've developed. Obviously, that can change. If a client requests a specific device or browser, that number would go up. And if for some reason they are willing to accept a little more risk, or they know for sure that they'll only be using it on an iPhone, then obviously our number would be lower. The spreadsheet you're seeing here on the presentation is just a snapshot of a report we generated for a recent web build. And what this is every line item is a feature on a page for a website, and every column is a device or a browser. So for every page and feature, we test it across anywhere from 10 to 20 separate combinations of browser, platform, and device.
And to be fair, so I screenshot this, and I didn't want to zoom out anymore because you wouldn't be able to read it. I couldn't get all the way over to the right, but basically you can see all the computers. So computers are rows D to N, and browsers behave differently on Mac and PC. So you have to be aware of that. Phones, the phones that we support. If you're dealing with a consumer-based product, iPhone and Android phones, and make sure that you're covering the different browsers. So that's where you see Safari 5 and Safari 6. That's two different version types of Safari and Android 2.3, and there's a few more 2.2s in there, 4.3, Windows IE 10. You can start to see how complicated it gets very quickly. TPK has left some particular browsers out because they fall on such a, there's such a small number of people using it that it's just not cost effective oftentimes to make them available. If your demographic is primarily businesses, and we're working with a client right now where they have a high number of business people use their service, you definitely want to be just making sure that BB10, for example, and we've got that on the list here as part of our standard, that BB10 is included. I just wanted this whole image here that you're looking at, it goes down to row 50, but I think the actual spreadsheet went down to something like 230 rows or something.
Amazing.
Which is...
And I just want to point out something too. Just because, your vendor may not support a browser, and let's use IE7 for instance, it doesn't mean that the site isn't going to necessarily function there. I think one of the points that's being made here is that you and your vendor need to come up with some kind of defined number of browsers, platforms, and devices. And it is not real and practical to sign off on something that says your website just will be supported on everything. It's a great deal if you get that, but there's risk. I really worry for any vendor that actually is promising that, and it's not looking at a full picture of the reality of what nowadays. So I think that was one of the main points here is really define what that is. You don't want to be too narrow that you're not getting the right amount of devices and browsers supported, and you don't want to be too broad that it's really not even practical. Virtual simulators exist as well, and you'll have, and that's a question you may want to ask your vendors if they are promising on a lot of things on a lot of these different sites. Find out which ones they are using simulators for and which ones they aren't as well, and actually are manually testing it. Because if they are using simulators, then they can obviously do a lot more. But there are some issues we find with some simulators as well. So it's a deeper conversation. TBK Creative, our process is we have defined what we believe and are comfortable with offering to clients that we think is generally speaking the right browsers and devices to test on. If you want to receive that list from us sometime to support you when you're defining your own list for your upcoming website, then just send me an email to Andrew at TBK Creative, and I'll make Andrew at tbkcreative.com, and I'll make sure that you get that list. We update that list. Andre's department, we update that list once a month. Web has become challenging in that things change, and there's always, as you know, new devices and platforms being released every day. So this is not a static list. This is an evolving list. So I just wanted to put that in there as well.
Good point. There was one particular project that we were working on last year, and it was, and sometimes these web projects can take 3 to 4 months. And we started the project where we were clear on exactly what devices the project would be tested on. All of a sudden, BB10 comes out. And then if we pull up the website on BB10, it's a new browser. No one's ever had access to it. There's no literature on the web about it. And you have to, now you're adding a ton of time to make sure that it works for BB10. And you're learning the nuances. So our development team is getting their hands on this browser for the first time, learning the nuances of it. So, that's how quickly things change.
Definitely, the landscape is always changing.
Now, Andre, to give people a background, this QA process, so this spreadsheet, this doesn't mean that every web vendor has to do it this way.
Absolutely not. No, you just want to know that there is something in place. You want to see an example of a previous testing phase, and you want to know that they were tracking issues and they also tracked successful tests. We chose to do a spreadsheet because we felt that a lot of the online services that you could use were just a little too heavy-handed and didn't really allow for truly collaborative testing. So what this spreadsheet allows us to do is to throw a team of, sometimes we'll throw 6 people at the website at once, and we're just all testing at once, and you can kind of see the results come up in real time, and it makes us really collaborative and responsive.
For sure.
So you're right, it could be anything, but I imagine at the very least it'll likely be a spreadsheet, I would hope.
Yeah.
The third pitfall in the quality assurance stage is lack of continuous integration. Bit of a fancy term, but all that it means is that the work that the developers are doing, so every line of code that they've written, is continuously tested for quality. And what continuously means is whenever I make a change, whenever I'm writing some code and I deem it ready to be tested, I would commit that code. I would push it to our code repository where all of the fancy work we've done kind of lives. And whenever I've pushed up a change, all of the code base gets run through a battery of tests, and it can report on actual errors, potential errors. It can report on deviations from standards that we are supposed to comply with, and these things happen automatically. The programmers don't need to worry about it. They're sent a report, and they then deem what they have to do with that report based on the results. So the idea is you want to make sure that the firm has a process like this that does give instantaneous reports and results on the quality of your code. This goes a long way towards ensuring that in the 9th hour before launch day, you're not scrambling to fix a massive bug that was missed. So something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the fourth is something that Andrew alluded to earlier, and that is virtual-only testing. So if the firm you're working with says that they do test on XYZ browser or device, you want to make sure that they don't do it exclusively virtually. So there's via simulators. There's services online that you can subscribe for, and you can test everything in a simulator. Fantastic if you really want to see how it behaves across many devices quickly, but it's not a perfect representation of what it will be like when it's in someone's hand on that device. So at TVK, we caution against virtual-only testing. You want to make sure, and you want to ask, do they use a blend of physical device testing and virtual testing? And like Andrew alluded to, ask them specifically which browsers and devices they test physically and which they test virtually. And you want to make sure that it's a nice blend and that it covers that demographic, the needs of your project.
And it's not to say that this virtual only testing, let's use the example of BB10. Basically, I could test BB10 in 2 ways. I could actually have the device in my hand, which makes it super easy because it's there. Now, that's obviously an investment, and there's lots of reiterations that browser is going to go through. So, some agencies have literally just rooms full of devices, It's not to say that virtual, so that's one way to do it, actually have the device in your hands, or the actual my goodness, old PC with IE6, Internet Explorer 6 on it, or Netscape. Now, no, I don't think I've ever met a web firm that tests their websites on Netscape for obvious reasons. But I'm just using that. I'm throwing it out there as an example. That's one way to test it. It actually physically touch the device. The second way to test it is there's a whole bunch of simulators online where it says, hey, we are going to connect to BB10 and do our best to represent how a BlackBerry phone is going to show this website. In our experience, it's close. It gets pretty darn close, but there's still going to be little nuances. And our stand is that it's extremely helpful to have virtual testing, but only doing virtual testing. So not having some of the top devices like iPhones, Android phones, and Blackberries and PC computers and all that stuff. You should have still the top used devices in your hands. Is kind of the way that we like to think about it. So hopefully that kind of helps to explain this whole thing called like virtual testing, because I know we're talking about a lot of techie talk here.
Yeah, it's it can get a little heavy sometimes, so I apologize.
It's okay.
So now we've done all the work, we've done all the testing, we are 6 months into the project, and it's time to launch the website to the world. This is kind of like the ribbon cutting. It's a very special day. It oftentimes is a stressful day, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the bad kind of stress. So there's a few things you want to keep in mind on launch day. And the 3 pitfalls listed in this section really all speak to planning. The very first item is underestimating the scheduling requirements for a launch day. In my experience, I've had launch days last an entire weekend. I've had some launch days take up 45 minutes. So it does vary a lot depending on the scope of the project. Is it a simple blog? Is it a simple like a personal website? Or is it a enterprise level e-commerce solution? So those specific demands of your project will affect who, when, and what you need to schedule for launch day. You'll likely want someone to lead the launch day, senior programmer, architect. You'll need folks possibly from a networking perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. You may need to tie in with marketers if they are releasing any collateral that day. You need to tie in with project managers. The list can go on. But you want to know that the teams successfully launched websites in the past, and ask for a launch day plan. See how they've scheduled things in the past, and you want to know that there is also an open communication throughout the day. That leads me into the next pitfall. Okay, so I guess I have a pitfall in between the next one. So this one is about the execution plan. So one's about scheduling people. 2 is about what are we doing and how are we doing it. So oftentimes this may be overkill, but for some projects it really is quite necessary. You need to be able to answer, as a vendor, answer questions in regards to who leads the launch day, what are the plans, what happens if we fall behind, what happens if we hit a roadblock, what happens if we're in the 9th hour of launch date and things aren't going well, can we back out our changes? These are questions that you want to, these are items you want the vendor to be discussing when you ask them, what kind of an execution plan do you typically put in place on launch day? And then to tie all of these things in is you want to make sure there's a communication plan in place. So it's great to know who's scheduled, what scheduled, when we're doing it, how we're doing it, but you also need to know how we are communicating. So who's involved, main points of contact if I have an emergency, items such as if we fall behind, who do I communicate that to? Different things, which stakeholders can be part of the day and would be available to talk if we have any questions. So you want to hear all of these topics kind of discussed when you talk about launch day. It's about scheduling, executing, and communicating. And you want to know that they have the ability to communicate to you that they've done these things in the past.
One way that I kind of like to say it is that if you're launching a website that is a little larger in nature and maybe has to, integrate, is an e-commerce website or integrate into, a database system, just leave that whole day open. Just leave it completely open. Don't schedule anything. Don't have any meetings scheduled. Like, leave it absolutely open. And even ask her if there's an IT professional that is internal that's going to be needed, even if they're only needed for 10 or 15 minutes. Just have their full day open and available. Most of the time, there's not going to necessarily be a major emergency that takes up somebody's whole day. But what you want to have happen, if there's any hiccup that happens at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, that everyone's able to be reached, to be able to handle the problem and make the types of immediate decisions in the moment to ensure that things go smoothly. And with every launch, there's almost always one thing where there's typically systems all trying to come together in one shot, where there could be one thing that goes awry. So leave it open is the best, solution. Make sure that everyone can be reachable and make sure everybody knows what their responsibilities are that day. So it's ensuring that everyone's clear what the lines of communications are. And if you've been through a launch day before, you might have lost a few strands of hair, or more than a few strands of hair, because it really can be certainly stressful. But one of the things that makes a launch day very stressful is when there wasn't a sufficient quality assurance process. I like to stress that. I know that was we kind of just went through quality assurance, but a lot of times what happens is the moment something goes live, all of a sudden it's kind of like people have put on like magnifying glasses, and they're staring at their website, and they're all of a sudden seeing all these things that they need addressed that day. And one of the analogies I like to give clients when they're actually using their website is, let's imagine this is live and there's thousands of people seeing this. You have to think differently when you're reviewing it. That's something that can make a launch day really stressful, is all of a sudden uncovering all these bugs because you're finally really going through the website scrupulously. So one, I highly suggest when you're testing your website before it goes live, imagine it's live. You're going to take that whole process way more seriously. And two, this is where quality assurance, if there wasn't a very good quality assurance page, you could be having Jessica from HR emailing you going, hey, I just checked it out on my Android and it's got 4 problems. Uh-oh. So that's where a lot of times a bunch of bugs get uncovered. So that's where a strong quality assurance phase is going to protect you, to make sure that day does not have you lose 50 strands of hair.
Or that last strand you had.
Or just the last one, or just the last strand. So, that's just a little bit of, what typically causes that day to go stressful. All right, my favorite slide of the presentation. Post-launch.
So, yeah.
Post-launch, staying alive. There's this assumption that the moment it goes live, it's now live forever. And that's not always true. That's why I've called this staying alive. If a web launch goes very, very poorly and all of a sudden all these bugs are uncovered because the quality assurance stage was just not done well enough, there are instances where websites are literally pulled down, and that happens. So this stage, and it's often a stage that web firms don't talk about. So, okay, we get the website launched and then, all's great and we're done and we get to all, move on and you've got your website. We take this stage as extremely important. So here's we consider this its own stage. Post-launch is a stage inside of TBK's web builds, and here's a bunch of tricks to help that right after it goes live just go smoother for you.
So yeah, like Melissa alluded to, your website and the devices that support your website really essentially are living things. I mean, they are digital, they are computer devices, but they really do need to be tended to after launch day. Launch day was great, let's say it went smoothly, but you need to worry about certain things. Maybe not worry, but keep in mind certain things once we're finished that day. Number one is security. Has security been considered and what has the vendor put in place to make sure that the server that is running your website is secure. How often are updates applied? And if updates do get applied to the server for patching, for security updates, how does that affect my website? Will it be down for a bit? When will this take place? You also want to make sure that they have someone responsible for maintaining the security of the web server or the servers for your site.
Mm-hmm.
If they're hosting your emails, make sure that your emails are secure. Ask the questions. I would love to tell you exactly what you want to hear on these questions, but the answers vary greatly. You just want to know that there are measures in place, that they're documented, and that they can talk about them to you.
Yeah.
The other pitfall, something that is often ignored, is what to do as your website matures. So does the infrastructure, which is the server, maybe the routers, maybe you have other servers just part of the farm, whatever that might be. What do we do as they age? They're going to get slower. Sometimes parts fail and break. How do we replace them? So you want to ask them, what's the policy for replacing aging hardware and or broken hardware? How quickly can the site come back online? And of course, this will depend on the goals and the purpose of your website. If the website was just a family gallery, I could likely live with a few days of downtime. But if my website is generating me thousands of dollars a day in revenue, I likely want that fixed as soon as possible. So again, use your judgment, figure out what you're safe with as far as downtime, and have that discussion with the vendor. The third one is one that I've had to learn through trial and error, and I usually don't recognize until I need a backup and I don't have one. I cannot stress this enough. It is so important to make sure there's a backup system in place. Oftentimes, people are reluctant to spend the money on this process, are reluctant to put in the time, because we never think it could happen to us until it does. So make sure your vendor has an automated backup system in place by asking them, do you have one? How often do they happen? And you also, probably the most important question is find out where these are stored. And the reason for this question is because you want to make sure that the backups of your website are stored in a geographical location that is separate from where your website runs. And that's for reasons of, fires or natural disasters. You want to make sure that there's a backup somewhere else that is always kept safe. You want to make sure that when they do have a backup process, that it's automated, that we don't rely on humans to trigger it manually because humans forget. Maybe ask for backup reports every time a backup runs. Send you an email saying, we now have a backup, it's dated today or something. You want to make sure that they have the technology to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's it.
Yeah, that's I was just reflecting on how much information we have given people in the past two webinars, so part 1 and part 2, and I acknowledge that it's a lot of information, and I acknowledge that a lot of it is technical information. We wanted to have this webinar because those failure rates, as we've pointed out time and time again, are so high. We sat down and thought, what the heck, like, why are these failure rates so high? What's going on to cause them? And we talked a lot about that in that first webinar, which is basically the state of the industry. But I think marketing managers or business owners or whoever is heading up a website project has to equip themselves with more information. That's why we did dive deeper on this particular webinar series than we've done in the past on other ones, and we have talked technical. It's just so important because a lot of these times these questions never get asked, they're never raised, and there's this assumption that your web vendor is going to have this handled, and that's not always the case. Sometimes it is, which is awesome. You've got a killer web vendor, and that's not always the case either. So I highly suggest that. I know it was a lot of information, but we actually have another support structure and system for you that's not necessarily this video. We have an e-guide that I know Andrew's going to talk about in a moment that we put together also with regards to this topic and conversation. But I really feel that it is in your best interest, and it's in your business best interest, and it's in your marketing department's best interest to know as much knowledge and to have as much knowledge and information that you can possibly have when you're hiring a vendor and working with a web vendor. And when you're asking these questions, you're really looking for confidence in what the web vendor's asking. And you're just looking, you're looking to use your own, instinct, spidey sense, whatever it is that gives you a sense of, I think they know what they're dealing with when they're talking about quality assurance, or, I don't know if that answer was particularly confident. Maybe they don't have a fully mapped out quality assurance phase. So this was all for everybody listening on this series. And if you couldn't join us live and you're listening to this online, I'll put this in there as well. This is really for your web project to go more smoothly. And also for web vendors to be considering all these different angles, because at the end of the day, oftentimes business is made online, whether it's e-commerce or professional service. Your website is your ecosystem of your business, and it's the most public representation of what you do. Oftentimes the most public representation of who you are, what you stand for, what you promise people, the services and products you sell. So ensuring that it's done right and is able to support itself in the future is extremely important.
Yeah, I think that last piece there, Mel, is a good point about the public representation part with websites these days. Mm-hmm. It wasn't always necessarily that much of a priority because not as many people use the web so pervasively. But recently, TVK did a internal study, and we found that the average retail company website gains over 3 times more traffic than their retail counterparts, so their brick and mortar stores. So that was the first thing that was a bit noticeable. Mm-hmm. The second thing is we looked at non-retail. Excuse me. We looked at non-retail, and we found that number was actually 10 times more. So non-retail organizations, so think manufacturers, think professional services firms, on average, non-retail businesses nowadays get over 10 times the amount of traffic on their website that their office location gets. That is a really incredible stat that should not be taken lightly. It really points to an opportunity for all of our businesses, everybody on the call, around web. So I think, what I really appreciate about this information is that I think this information today starts to help solve some of the problems that are out there for all of us when it comes to web development. It is challenging. There's no doubt about it, and it will stay challenging, and it's each of our jobs to continually do our best to self-educate ourselves, especially as on the corporate end for all the corporations on the call today. The best thing that you can do is continue to educate yourself, I believe, so that you might not be the expert with web development. That's why you're outsourcing it, but at least empower yourself with the right questions to overcome this challenge. And so I think we're in this kind of crux where the web is a very challenging thing, but it's also a huge opportunity when you think about the statistics that I just shared. So what I want to do now is I want to go to some questions here that have come in for Andre and Melissa. This is from Marie. Andre or Melissa, do you guys have any tips for figuring out budgeting for a new website?
Ooh, awesome question. Andre, do you mind if I grab this and I'll shoot it to you at the end?
It's all yours.
Thank you. Man, you have asked a very difficult question, and I think you're not alone in this. You are not alone whatsoever in this question. I have a lot of inspiration with other firms that inspire me all across the world, and I'm highly inspired by some of the top artists and web firms across the world. So I follow lots of different companies, and time again, You know, a few have mentioned some of the top web firms in the world have mentioned the number one problem and the number one reason why websites fail is because budgets are too slim. And we talked about that on our first webinar, so please go back and listen to that. But that doesn't help solve the question of, okay, so we might recognize that that's a problem. But how do you create a budget now for a website? My suggestion would be, if you're looking to get a sense of, you know, how much to budget, this is going to sound almost arbitrary, and I really wish I had something more concrete. But I'll give you a sense of what TBK can come in at, and what people higher than TBK offer, and what people lower in price than TBK offer, and maybe that will help people here get a sense. And we like to do this from a sales perspective also, like just give people a range of where websites are coming in. For a custom designed website, so fully custom, not from a template. And I stress that a lot here, that there's two ways to kind of attack a project. And TBK does offer kind of both options. The first place that you'll want to start from before you even actually, so I'm going to step back a moment here. The first place you want to come from when you're working on your website is, when you're coming up with a budget, is how many dollars do I expect this website to generate me?
Good one. Yeah.
Just come from there first. And a lot of times people think that their website is simply an expense on the books. And it's not okay, yes, it's an expense in the sense that it costs dollars, but it generates dollars. It's an investment that your company's making. So the very first place I like to start from is how many dollars can your website generate you? And that's something that TBK, it's a process that TBK has perfected. We have a number of algorithms that we go through, and we also bring our experience in what certain industries are able to perform at in terms of lead generation online. So basically start there. You may not have a sense. You may not go, okay, well, I think our website can generate us, $750,000 this year. But you might just want to talk with whoever needs to be part of that conversation internally and say, what should this generate us? Let's step back a moment here and say, if our website could generate us any dollar amount that we wanted, and I know that we're not coming from a sense of reality here. We'll get to that in a moment. But listen, if our website could generate us dollars, how many dollars could it generate us? And what would be a number that we would be happy with? And it might be 300,000 in 1 year. It might be 600,000 1 year. It may be 20 million in 1 year. So I always like to come from there first, because that is what your website is here to do for most businesses that are not necessarily blog focused. Your website's there to generate dollars so people know more about your product and services, and it's the number one spot they're going to go. So start there. Also, loop in a web vendor that can help you figure that out. So help you figure out, what, in your industry, with your number of web hits, with your average sale and your closing rate, here's what we think is possible with your website to generate you dollars. Come from there. So once you get that number and you start to get a sense of the opportunity that you have with your website, now all of a sudden you end up in a completely different conversation. Now the conversation is, okay, oftentimes people realize that they've been sitting on a gold mine and not even realizing it. So I'm a huge proponent of being clear what your opportunity is. A lot of times companies are just so underutilizing web that the moment that they, change their website, their profits go up significantly. The number of leads they get, the number of their close ratio goes up. They attract a demographic that has more dollars to spend. It's unbelievable what happens. So figure that out. Go to web vendor, get a sense of the opportunities that you have online. That's going to dictate how much you should be budgeting. A local pizza shop with, say, 1 or 2 locations, probably shouldn't be spending $30,000 or more on a website, because they might not see the dollars back from that. That's where a template site, and I don't have anything against template sites, but that's where a template site really can serve a valuable purpose in that circumstance. And a template website can come anywhere from a very, very basic with, say, only like 5 to 10 pages of content, might be anywhere from 4,500 to 5,000. If it gets a little bit more complicated and you're adding content, you go up to 7,500 or even 10. So template websites are in and around that range. Then you can, talk about, well, if my website can generate me 100,000 or more in the next 12 months, maybe I shouldn't be going for a template website, because a template website is not going to have the lead conversion that a custom designed website is going to have. It just won't. So now you're in a conversation of, how do we maximize how many people we're able to close online? If we have 10 sales guys all across Canada or the US constantly sending people to our website and the average sale is 50 grand, you might want to consider putting more into your website to help those people, to close the gap with communications, to wow people, tell your story. Now you're into more custom communication, brand, and custom coding, and TBK specializes in that. It's where our heart lies, and it's what we love to do, and it's why we're winning accolades in terms of awards, and we recently just won Profit Hot 50 in Canada. So that's where magic's made, and that's where you can end up with websites that have massive conversion rates, and you might be in that boat. And those types of websites from a range, can start anywhere on a very, very, very low end of like 15,000, but honestly, they go up. An e-commerce site, if you need to do e-commerce sales and you're looking for your website to generate you, let's say 100,000 or more per year, I would certainly be setting aside a budget of a minimum $50,000. And that's because e-commerce, there's just so much on the line with e-commerce. It has to be done very, very well. So
sort of interject there with just a supportive point, Mel. We have one client, everybody, who has it's retail, and they have an e-commerce site. It does over $3 million a year. So that would be an instance where, that can really help if you're in that same boat. If you were retail in that same boat, when you know that's possible, and you might have to do some of your own research and talk to other industry professionals. But if you're really dealing with that kind of potential economically, then that can really drive your budgeting decisions, as Mel is pointing out. That might be a company that wants to spend $100 grand, $200 grand on a website to do it well, because we're talking millions of dollars in annual revenues here.
And
Mel, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go I want to grab just two more questions.
Sure.
before the timeline. But I really like where you went with that around ROI, because I think that is a driver of decisions. It's usually not. It should be, I should say, a driver of decisions. So I do encourage that as well when you're talking within your own team. And Jonathan asks, what's the best content management system out there?
Can I answer?
Yes, go for it.
In my mind, without a doubt, it's WordPress. There are millions of websites using WordPress. There is an incredible network of developers who understand, who code for WordPress. There are over 30,000 free plugins for WordPress that do various things for SEO purposes, for specific content management, for image galleries. It's just fantastic. Other CMSs you may hear of are Drupal or Joomla. Usable, but really built for developers, not for, say, a business developer or a marketer or small business owner. So WordPress all the way.
Awesome. I'll just add a little point to that. A lot of times, web firms or agencies that are headed by developers, they like to sell Drupal, and it's Drupal and Joomla. And as Andre pointed out, they're actually really awesome for people who think from a development perspective. But most of the time, people who are going to log into a CMS, they're not developers. They are people who need to manage and use the website. And for that reason, TBK chose years ago to go WordPress, because it is the easiest content management system to update. In our opinion, it's super user-friendly. And it's very easy for people to use. So we code in WordPress, and we love it.
Yeah, make no mistake about it. Obviously, we're gonna answer that question with the CMS we actually like to program in. we are business too. But I think what Mel just pointed out there is a very, very important point, and I was involved in that conversation about 3.5 years ago. Our only programmer at that time, 3.5 years ago, when we were first starting out as an organization, actually his background was in a different content management system. That was actually his expertise, and we spoke about it. Melissa, who is a non-programmer, really did her homework and tested a lot of different content management systems. And we talked more about it. And then we made a decision that we felt was in the best interest for our clients at that point in time, and we decided to specialize in WordPress. We felt that's where a lot of the web was going, and thankfully we hedged correctly. If you're into a e-commerce site, that you can certainly build websites on WordPress as well, and we've done it very successfully. We're also fans of Magento as well for e-commerce as an alternative as well. Both those are up there in our repertoire. Last question for today, and then we'll wrap up. And if I wasn't able to get to your question, feel free, of course, to email me at andrew@tbkcreative.com, and I'll be able to chat with you about your question as well. In terms of after a site launches, and this is a very intelligent question, so I can tell Nancy has been through website projects before in the past. She asks Andre and Mel, how much should one budget after a website launches?
Ooh, that's another very good question. That is something that, again, it comes from how many dollars you're looking for your website to generate you on a yearly basis, which you can break down per month. If you are dealing with, let's say, if you are looking to do, I'm just going to use $120,000 because it divides very nicely into 12. If it's a smaller scale website, a smaller business, and your website needs to generate you $100,000, that means that you're dealing with $10,000 profit. You might have a very low budget of what you should, have to set aside monthly. You might want to go quarterly. There's still the option to do like a quarterly update on a website that's not going to provide a massive ROI, but most websites are doing more than $100,000 per year in terms of sales, just by literally collecting leads and phone calls. So what you might want to do is, again, it's how much money you're looking for it to generate, and you make a decision based on what happens if it goes down, what happens if the technology is out of date, how much money you're going to be losing just on downtime, and that's going to help you figure that out. Technology is changing all the time. There are new devices. Acer just announced that it's coming out with a new phone that's going to be running, I believe it's Windows. That, technology is changing, so it is smart to set aside a monthly budget. How much that budget ought to be, it depends significantly. It really just changes. But Andrew, I'm thinking if you were to set aside anywhere from $500 to $1,000 on a larger web build, just so that you have people available if anything happens, and to make sure that your basics of the website's being covered. Great. TBK actually almost flips this conversation a little bit and comes from what does the website need to optimally behave consistently, and sometimes that includes services that's more than just development. That might include help with graphic design, that might include help with SEO, and that might include running digital advertising campaigns, so Google campaigns for you, so that's pushing more traffic to your website. So oftentimes we have this conversation with clients, and TBK offers managed services, which is kind of unique in this field, that's able to really come and support you with all the things that you're going to need so that that website performs optimally. And that, again, is just a budget that, it depends on what we think your website can generate you. So that just differs based on that conversation.
Yeah, good point at the end there, Mel. And I was actually going to go there as well to kind of summarize what you were saying, is that it's a difficult question to answer in a short way in terms of budgeting. So to summarize Mel's last point there, do your homework, do your best to really measure ROI always on the site, and let that drive a lot of your decisions. If you're unhappy with the with the ROI you're getting, then look at spending money in the right ways to increase that. If you are really happy with your ROI, that might be able to dictate how much you should be budgeting to try to increase that ROI further. So it's a lot about, you're doing your own homework, analyzing your numbers, and having that right partner for you. So I want to wrap up the call, really acknowledge each and everybody who joined this call today. It's really paramount. Paramount's actually not the right word. It's really obvious to me that the type of person that comes on this call in the middle of an afternoon on a Thursday when we're all very busy in September is somebody who's really committed to something for their organizations that they represent. So I really acknowledge you for continually doing your own homework to educate yourself so that you can give your organization the best foot forward when it comes to web. So I really acknowledge you for that. About 10 minutes ago, I sent you all a message. There is a URL there where you can go and download for free the e-guide that we spoke about as well that should support you in advance to your next website project. This call today was recorded, so you can go to tbkcreative.com in about 7 days or so, and this will be up in our TBKU section as a blog. So it'll be up on YouTube and embedded in the blog, and it'll be available for you and your team as well if you want to go back and you can gather your notes from there. Thank you, everybody, for being on the call, and have a great day. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.